Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome along to this final session of today's discussion about the future of regional statistics. My name is Graeme and I'm Dean of External Engagement in the College of Social Sciences at the University of Glasgow and a member of ESCoE. And delighted for this final panel session, we're joined by three distinguished speakers who are going to give us their reflections on the future demands and supply of regional statistics in the UK. So we'll be hearing from Ed Humpherson, Director General for Regulation from the UK Stats Authority, Jonathan Athow, Deputy National Statistician and Director General Economic Statistics at the ONS, and Jane Naylor, Head of Statistics at the Department for International Trade. And what we're going to do is we're going to hear from each of our speakers in turn, who will give some remarks for between 5 to 10 minutes to give us their reflections and insights. And then we'll open it up for questions. And as before, if you can type the question into the Q&A, I'll do my best to get around as many questions as we possibly can. Without further ado, if I could hand over to Ed to kick us off in this session. Ed, thanks very much for joining us.
Thank you, Graeme, and good afternoon, everyone. And thanks to everyone who's presented and asked questions earlier on in the day. It's been a really good discussion. I've enjoyed it a lot. The title of today is ever-increasing demand for regional statistics. And I want to look at that issue of ever-increasing demand from what I'd rather grandiosely call a political economy, the political economy of regional statistics, or to put it in a slightly more humble way, I want to decompose that ever-increasing demand into its component parts. Just before I do so, for those of you who aren't familiar with us and our role, I'm the head of regulation at the UK Statistics Authority and head of an organisation called the Office for Statistics Regulation. And our role is to set the standards for statistics produced by any part of government in the UK. That's ONS, but also all the government departments, including Jane Naylor's department, and the governments of Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland. We set the standards and then we uphold those standards by doing assessments and reviews, and from time to time stepping into public debate where we think there's an issue with how statistics are being presented publicly. In a way, demand for users, for insight, for data is at the heart of our work. And I always think of our job as being supporting, encouraging, nudging, and maybe sometimes cajoling producers of statistics into meeting user demand. So if there are new demands or ever increasing demands, it's important for us to understand it so we can then relay that into our work to get producers of statistics to meet the demand. So three things I think are going on when we talk about increasing demand for regional statistics. This is often compressed into the notion of levelling up, but I think it's got different facets which require very different measurement approaches. The first facet, the first component of demand is an ongoing, a long-standing interest in regional imbalances in the UK economy. This is the observation that the UK is particularly imbalanced, more imbalanced than it was in the past, and much more imbalanced than other economies, equivalent economies. That's a sort of very general consensus, well supported by the available statistics. Just as an aside, it's worth saying that there are some dissenters from that consensus. I've heard Chris Giles of the Financial Times argue that actually this apparent regional imbalance is an artifact of how the UK defines its regions. But I think in general, it's a generally accepted point of view. And whether the consensus or the dissenting view is right, either way, regional statistics, regional economic statistics are at the heart of understanding this notion of imbalances. And then secondly, and quite distinctly from that, there's an interest in measuring household welfare going beyond GDP. So the regional imbalances debate is typically one which takes a national GDP, a national accounts picture, and disaggregates it. But there is a lot of good analysis which says actually that's a very imperfect way of describing household welfare experiences. They differ from GDP and they appear to be very much more granular and geographically dispersed than a regional analysis would suggest. This is the work of Andrew Aitken and Martin Wheel. I thought it was fascinating to hear that earlier about defining a single geographic well-being metric which captures a range of issues that go into welfare beyond just a disaggregation of GDP. So there's a second thing, which is, can we measure household experiences and the dispersion of household experiences in a different way? And then the third thing which is going on when people have this ever increasing demand, I think is much more fuzzy, certainly fuzzy in my mind, but really, really important. And that is that I think that notions of representation and identity are shifting. Notions of how to represent the identity of an individual or a household or an area into statistics are shifting, and actually also how to represent those identities in political institutions. And my sort of examples to illustrate that is, I've got three sort of aspects of that. One is this notion of the region being a very sort of uncertain concept. People use the term Northwest or Southeast, and yet people who work in those areas say, well, actually, it's a very, very unhelpful agglomeration. It doesn't really reflect the sort of identity reality or the political reality of the sub-regions that make it up. Second issue is that people say that national institutions, economic decision-making institutions, are not very good at representing the variety of local interests. There's a strong argument from McCann, University of Sheffield, around the need for governance that reflects local economic patterns and not just the national economic decision-making. That's about a shifting notion of representation. And then at the personal level, there are kind of debates raging about how to represent identity in statistics, around ethnicity, around sex, around gender. So you see lots of these things shifting, and you see the people who produce statistics trying to adjust to those shifts. Each of these three things feature in our work as a statistics regulator. So the first, the regional imbalances, we do lots of work on assessing regional statistics. We've really done a lot of work on ONS's balanced regional estimates, and encouraged and supported the increasing timeliness of those estimates. So that's all good. I'd also say I'd really support Stuart McIntyre's work on regional nowcasting. And when I was hearing him present this morning, the thought running through my mind is, shouldn't we be doing an assessment of those against the Code of Practice for Statistics? They look and feel like they've got the rigor and the sort of trustworthiness that we look for in all statistics. So that's maybe something to explore. On the second area, this idea of household welfare experiences not being captured in current measures, we do lots of work on things like income and earnings and poverty. We've just published a review of poverty statistics, which encouraged great use of admin data to give a better regional picture of household experiences. I think we've done less work on this kind of beyond GDP argument. I mean, we may want to return to that, and I'd really be interested to know how Martin and Andrew Aitken's work develops, because that looks really, really promising to me, but it's certainly an area of interest. And on the third, this idea of identity shifting, we do lots of work on the individual space, things like how ethnicity is reported in statistics, very active in terms of how sex and gender should be reported. At the sort of more aggregate level, a couple of things I want to highlight. During the pandemic, we've really done a huge amount of work to support greater granularity. A feature of our interventions has been one of the governments of the UK mentioning some data that talk about Preston or Leicester or somewhere like that, and we step in and say, you really need to make those data available. People need to understand on what basis you're making those claims. And Jane, I'm sure, as a head of statistics in a government department, will say we're quite assiduous in following up with government departments where we think there's a need for more granular data to be made available. And we've also advocated a thought about governance, which I think gets to this point about identity, which is to say that if economic statistics look like they're produced by a central body to serve central decision makers, we might be missing this notion of identity shifting. And we've recommended in a submission to the Treasury Select Committee that actually ONS might want to explore much stronger regionalisation of their operations, so that the economic production of economic statistics is closer to the use of economic statistics. Be interesting to get Jonathan's thoughts about that. Anyway, I'll stop there, Graeme. I think the key point I want to get across is that when we talk about this ever increasing demand, it's really helpful, I think, to decompose that demand into imbalances, household welfare experiences, and then representation and identity and governance. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Great, thanks very much. That's a great introduction, a great oversight, and I'm sure there's lots of questions already going through people's minds on your comments here. I should say, if you want to pose a question and you're worried about forgetting it, type it in just now and we'll come back to it when we come to the Q&A. So thanks very much, Ed. If I could hand over to you, Jonathan, to get your reflections, please.
Thank you. And I've got a few to offer from a sort of a producer side. And I'll start with something that is around sort of, I put loosely under priorities. And I tell the story around after the 2016 referendum on leaving the EU, there was a huge interest in trade statistics. And if I went and talked to people about what they wanted, and I said, what do you really need with trade statistics? What do you want? And they want all of it now. And sometimes that's what it feels a bit like on the with some of the country or regional or local statistics. And to begin with, I think this wasn't a huge priority, because if I cast my mind back, say 5 years, we weren't offering many statistics at a local enough level, and actually that we've done quite a bit to push many of our statistical domains more locally. But we now need to get, I think, into a world of a more coherent strategy, thinking about kind of at what level should we be aiming for in each of our statistical domains. And I think we're now trying to be put in place more of a sort of coherent strategy to think about kind of what's a sensible place to be. Where you might want to get to with prices might be different from where you want to get to with labour market statistics or with crime statistics or whatever. So again, I think you need to think quite carefully about that. To begin with, it was kind of fine. You needed to push in all of those out, but where do we need to get to now? Secondly, there is some interesting, I don't know if trade-offs is the right way, but I'll use the word trade-off around UK-wide versus more detailed statistics. You know, we're you know, the economy is constantly changing. People are looking for new statistics on a UK-wide basis, and we need to think carefully about where we put our resources to develop UK-wide statistics. So a good example for those of you who are interested in things like GDP and the national accounts, we have double deflation coming into our GDP estimates later this year. That will give them an improvement, but that's a UK-wide development. You know, if we've got an extra pound, where do we put that into those? Is it UK-wide? Is it subnational statistics? And I think there's also a challenge here as well around, you know, and I completely agree with Ed that sometimes starting from a national statistic and breaking it down and disaggregating is not the right thing to do. But people also want coherence. They want, if I'm comparing a statistic over here about one part of the UK, how can I ensure there's consistency, or at least they add up to the total? So there are some sort of issues and challenges there. A few other things. One, I think one of the challenges we also face is that the growing demand here is not just for subnational statistics in one particular domain, but it's often cross-cutting domain. So people, yes, want to know what is you know, the economic output of a particular part of the UK, but they also want to know kind of what are the industries related to that. So it often becomes multi-dimensional, the challenge here. So that adds a complexity to this, that it's not just about GDP, it's about how do you join up statistics across domains around a local area, because actually people don't really care about kind of what the domains, how we look at the statistics. What they care about is having all the data joined up around that local area, because, you know, local economies work, local labour markets interact with local output, and as Ed said, that all feeds through to things like welfare. A couple of other final thoughts from me. One is there's a huge opportunity in some of the new data sources we have been working with. One that I would particularly highlight, and we've innovated a lot during the pandemic, is the PAYE data, real-time information data from HMRC. That provides you with details on all employees on the payroll, and we are cutting that in new ways. There are plans to push that down to NUTS 3 level, so it gives you much more detailed information. But some of these new data sources are going to be the ways we unlock some of this, some of this data. So some really exciting opportunities there in some of those alternative data sources. Finally, there's a real challenge as a producer of statistics about how you disseminate all this information. How do you tell the picture? How do you tell the story about particular parts of the country? And for those of you who follow follow sort of ONS people on Twitter, you will follow people like Ahmed Barkley, who has put together various interactive maps. Now we're using the same technology we're using for the census to then apply that more generally, but that allows you to start thinking about new ways of disseminating. But that's really complex when you've got lots and lots of local areas, people wanting to know very localized statistics. It's a sort of extension of Ed's point that a region no longer becomes the meaningful way of looking at things. People want local data. They want to be able to see on a map what the area is and all the relevant information around that. So that becomes a new challenge. So all of these are things we are thinking through. For us, it's about creating that strategy. How do we want to, which of those areas do we want to pursue first? Where are the areas where there's greatest need for us to make our statistics our statistics more granular? One thing I would say, and I think Ed makes a very good point about engagement, is the challenge when you are starting to engage with hundreds of local organizations, whether that's government or private sector organizations or third sector organizations, is how do you engage with that coherently? It's a real step change in the needs of what we need to do. So there's also a challenge there, but these are all the things we're grappling with. I don't think there's any easy answers to any of them, but I think there's huge potential here. Lots of things we can do, lots of things we are experimenting with, and I think there's going to be a very rich future here to think about how we can make this data more joined up, more able to meet that local user need. And I think I'll draw my comments to a close there and hand back to Graeme.
Great, thank you very much, Jonathan. And last but not least, Jane, over to you. As the person responsible for giving us everything on trade yesterday or today, then it would be great to get your reflections on the demand for regional statistics, particularly in your world.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Graeme, and thank you very much for inviting me to be part of this panel. Yes, as you say, in my role as Chief Statistician at the Department for International Trade, I'm going to focus particularly on regional trade and investment statistics. For those of you who don't know, the Department for International Trade responsibilities are around helping businesses to export, to driving inward and outward investment, negotiating market access and trade deals, and championing free trade. And all of those responsibilities have that have kept that regional angle to them. I'm going to focus on three things. Firstly, I'll have some reflections on the growing need for regional statistics. Then talk about some of the challenges this brings, particularly when we're supporting policy making. As an analyst working in a policy department, some of the challenges that brings when we're looking at the regional angle, but also then finish on how we are addressing some of those challenges. So firstly, on the growing demand, I would definitely agree with my fellow panel members. There is a growing demand for more granular statistics, in particular subnational statistics, helping us to understand our local areas and our local economies. And I think COVID has accelerated a lot of developments in statistics, including that demand for subnational data, as well as accelerating the need for sort of more timely, more frequent statistics, particularly when we were, and still are trying to understand the pandemic and its impacts. And I think we've seen the government analytical community respond brilliantly with lots of new innovative work. The demand for regional statistics is also, as I think Ed mentioned, driven by the levelling up agenda as well. I think that's been a key driver. So COVID has the potential to create inequalities, and therefore I think the levelling up agenda is even more important. We need to understand and have regional and sub-regional statistics in order to understand the impact of COVID across the different regions and nations of the UK, and also, more importantly, to monitor importantly, support and monitor sort of recovery across those areas. So definitely a growing demand. So then to kind of focus on some of the challenges this brings when we're supporting policy making and the analysis for alongside policy making. So if we are developing policies, for example, around levelling up or COVID recovery at the sub-national level, then we need to ensure we can monitor and evaluate the impact of those policies. And some of the challenges, the data and the statistics that we need do not always exactly match what we need. They don't always align exactly with the policy needs. Another challenge is that policy can sometimes change quite quickly, whereas developments, we know, in kind of data and statistics can take time and require time. So there's sometimes kind of a tension there. So just thinking as an example from the Department for International Trade, we're obviously keen to support and promote across exporting across all of the country and across all of the regions of the UK. And so how do we measure kind of progress here? How do we measure if exports are increasing at the regional level? And we do have regional trade statistics, but at the moment, at present, we don't have one consistent measure of regional trade. So we have HMRC regional trade statistics on trading goods. We have the ONS estimates on trading services, but we can't actually put those together. They're not on a consistent basis. They're not on the same kind of timeliness. So just kind of creating one measure of exports at a regional level isn't possible at the moment. So there's kind of some, the data, the statistics don't always kind of align with exactly what we want to measure for policy making. During the pandemic, and particularly since EU transition, we've obviously been really important to understand the impact of those on trade and the impact at the regional level. But again, timeliness is an issue here. For regional trade statistics, it'll be the 7th of July, HMRC will be releasing their regional trade statistics for the first quarter of 2021. So in July, we're getting the figures for January, February, March. It takes time to get those. So if you're responding to something quite quickly, your policy is requiring quite quick answers. Sometimes the official statistics aren't always there for us to do that. As has been mentioned by Jonathan and actually by the previous speaker, during the pandemic, we've seen lots of new statistics being released for small geographies, really timely, which is great. But I think one thing we've got to understand is quite often those statistics were based on administrative data, where it's potentially fairly more straightforward to collect geographical information. For example, claimant count that someone mentioned earlier. I think we have to kind of manage expectations. There's been some brilliant things that have been pushed forward during COVID, but we have to manage expectations that all data is available to that detail and that sort of timeliness. If statistics are based on surveys, for example, which a lot of trade statistics are, then it's much more challenging to do something in a timely manner at a really sort of small level of detail, because the sample sizes may not be large enough to provide informative estimates for those small geographies. We've also got to be mindful around things like confidentiality as well. And also for trade and investment, I think it was mentioned earlier when in the BIC survey presentation, we've got this added complication around kind of trying to assign trade to small areas. Often when we collect information about trade, the geographical information we get about the business is its headquarters, whereas many businesses will have local sites. And how do you then distribute trade to those local sites? We have methods for doing that, but there's more work that we could be doing. But it does mean there's some constraints about kind of just clicking your fingers and getting regional trade statistics. So there's quite a job to do managing expectations there. I'll keep going with the challenges. I am going to come to some ways we're working on them at the moment as well. And another sort of challenge, and it's been mentioned by previous speakers, is the kind of geography. There is a demand for regional statistics, but actually the demand goes smaller than that. People don't associate themselves with the Northeast, they associate themselves with Sunderland or a city. So the demand isn't just for regional statistics, the demand is sub-regional statistics as well, so pushing the data even further. And one particular issue that we've kind of grappling with partners with ONS is also around trade, is not just understanding international trade at the regional level, but understanding intra-regional trade. So not just how much does this particular region export to France, but how much does the southeast trade with the northwest, how much does Scotland trade with England, the kind of intra-regional stats, which is really kind of challenging as well. So I did say I'd come on to some ways that we are addressing those challenges. As you can say, quite challenging. And for me, I think one really key thing is, as an analyst working in a policy department, is working closely with policy colleagues. So really from the start of kind of working on policy, understanding their requirements, understanding their needs for analysis and statistics, but also working really closely with producers of statistics and almost acting as a bridge between the two. So understanding what policymakers need, but also understanding the challenges of producers of statistics and kind of balancing those two and working together. And also trying to kind of anticipate where policy is going. As I said earlier, it sometimes takes some time to develop statistics. So thinking about what's coming along in a year, 2 years' time, where do we think the kind of drivers are, so we can put that into plans for the development of statistics. And as I say, working very closely with producers of statistics. So we work incredibly closely with the ONS, with Jonathan and his team, in order to push forward the developments in trade statistics. We also work with international partners, the OECD and the WTO as well. But just with the ONS, lots of examples where they really have produced some really, pushed forward and developed experimental statistics, thinking about the regional estimates of trade in services, regional estimates of foreign direct investment, experimental estimates of trade by sector and commodity, the modes of supply statistics, where we've got to understand kind of how services can be broken down. That was incredibly useful in COVID, but that started kind of a couple of years ago. So you're going to have to anticipating what might come up. So it's really important to work collaboratively with producers, but also with policymakers and act as that bridge. Also working with academics, for example, colleagues I know probably on the line from University of Strathclyde, Fraser of Allender Institute, where we've been working and commissioned, DIT commissioned them to produce estimates of jobs supported by exports. And there was an element of a regional angle there as well, helping us to understand and demonstrate the impact that exporting has on local labour markets. So again, thinking about kind of not just the trade stats, but how they relate to the kind of local economies and the impact they're having, that link between trade and jobs as well. So we need to be innovative to address these challenges. I think we need to think about new ways of capturing trade activity at the subnational level, but doing that in a consistent way. We're doing a lot of work, as I say, and supporting the ONS and their work in terms of pushing the current collections. But I do think we also, and it's been mentioned before, kind of step back and think of new and innovative ways. Are there new surveys that we need? Are we pushing the current collections too far? Do we need to explore new and novel data sources that have been mentioned before during the pandemic, in order to provide those new sort of more timely estimates of trade or indicators of trade? We've been looking at alternative data sources like the ONS faster indicators, the BIC survey data, data on freight movements, data on shipping movements. So combining the strength of those data sources in terms of their timeliness with the strength of official sources in terms of their quality. So combining the strength of different data sources to meet some of these needs. And also, I think we need to think about new approaches, not just new data sources, but new approaches. So where surveys don't always give us the data that we need at the granular level, can we combine it with administrative data sources in kind of modelling frameworks, small area estimation approaches to get down to the levels that we need? And one thing that's been a bit of a game changer for us at DIT is the Trade Act becoming law, which means that other government departments now can request access to detailed HMRC data on trade. So really using kind of microdata, individual level data, and that's opened up lots of possibilities for us now. So really just to summarise, I think there is an increasing demand for regional statistics. That brings challenges when you're working in a policy department, making sure that the statistics and the data measure what we need and changing, making sure it's evolving over time with policy making. And there's some specific challenges around kind of measuring sub-national trade. I think the way that we approach those is through innovation and through collaboration. And the last point I just wanted to make was when we do start pushing that data further, when we're using new and novel data sources, when we're using new innovative approaches and producing kind of more granular statistics, we've got to be really clear about how we've done that, about communicating the methods, but communicating the limitations and the uncertainty as well. So users are clear about what they can and can't do, and policymakers are clear about what they can and can't do with the data sources. I'll leave it there.
Great, excellent. Thank you very much, Jane, Ed and Jonathan. So now we've got half an hour for Q&A. So if people could type their questions into the question answer, we'll get round to the questions as we go. And perhaps I could just kind of abuse Chair's privilege and maybe ask the first question around how do we balance demands for greater local statistics with also being clear about the challenges that you've all highlighted about measuring data at a local level, but also interpreting them. I recall being asked once to brief a minister on what the male youth unemployment rate was in Orkney and why it had increased by 100% in the space of a year. And there's quite a bit of education that needs to go on at that level to understand and interpret statistics. So what do you think we need to do to invest not just in the production of statistics, but in the production of intelligence, of being able to use statistics at a local level?
I'm happy to.
Okay, Jane, do you want to go first?
Yeah, I'm happy to come in. Yes, that's sounds like a familiar situation. And as I said when I was speaking, particularly when there are lots of statistics available at very small levels, you can look at something at the postcode level. It's difficult to, for some people to understand that say, for example, trade data, we don't have it at the postcode level. So there's a lot, like you say, there's a lot of education, and I think as producers and analysts, it's our job to make sure we communicate what isn't possible, and to push the boundaries, and to try and kind of work, as I said, collaboratively with different producers, with academics, to see how far we can and to push the data further, but then be very clear about what the limitations are. And making sure there's still that kind of analytical integrity, drawing the line that you can't go, say, below a certain level or into a certain, level of detail, because then we're just not confident on the robustness. We're not, perhaps it raises issues with confidentiality. So I think being very clear about what you can, when we do produce the statistics, what you can and you can't do with them, and working very closely with experts like from the ONS that can help us with those decisions about how far can we really push the data.
Great. I think, Jonathan, you wanted to come in?
And I was just going to say, this is, I think it's a problem that becomes more acute when you start offering more granularity in data, however you do it. But these problems are there in our headline statistics. For those of you who followed, national UK-wide statistics over the recent past, base effects from the start of the pandemic are now playing all sorts of having all sorts of interesting effects on our 12-month growth rates. And so, but the ultimate point here is, I think our job is not done as statisticians when the numbers are published. It's done when they are understood. And so engaging with users, using different channels to explain our statistics, whether that's Twitter, whether that's blogs, whether that's whatever articles, is really, 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 really important. But it becomes harder when you are producing, if you're producing statistics for, very disaggregated areas, you can't always do that. So it is going to be a challenge. I think it's probably it's not sort of something that's unique to those issues. Some of the some of the challenges do become a little bit more pronounced because you're publishing so much data, and there's bound to be something in there, a bit like your example from Orkney, where you get some very strong growth rate or something that is mainly a statistical artifact, or simply noise. So you need to be very, very, very careful about it. But I think it's kind of engaging with users. There's no there's no substitute for engaging with users. Not always going to work, but it's what you need to do.
Great, thanks, Jonathan. I'm not entirely sure if Ed is frozen, because he did mention he was having an internet connection. So he's either doing a very good impression of staying exceptionally still, or his internet is frozen. So what I'll do is I'll move on to the next question. Maybe Ed, when we get the connection back, you can come back in on that one. I think Mary Spouge has got a question. Mary, do you want to ask your question in person if you're there?
Yeah, I'm here. Can you hear me?
All right, great.
I guess it was sort of for Jane and Jonathan, which is lucky given that Ed's frozen. But I was just struck by what you were saying, Jane, about the limitations of certain types of data and communicating that. And obviously, at the Fraser, we really enjoyed working with your colleagues on the jobs and embodied in trade project. It was a really interesting project. And we could see how policymakers might wish to use it in different ways and sort of take it down to small geographies, perhaps, to understand the impacts that trade might have at small geographies. So I guess I wanted to get your views quickly of the kind of conceptual challenges, not just the data challenges when it comes to production of regional, particularly trade statistics. You know, when we're thinking about things like services, you know, more data from more companies or whatever might not necessarily solve those issues, because some of these issues are quite conceptual in terms of you know, where trade is actually originating from, where it's going to, where there are actual origins and destinations, and how that links up with freight statistics or other things. So, you know, it's not always just data. It's sometimes these are really difficult concepts to think about at quite a small geographic level, which makes it even more challenging, I think. I don't know if that was anyway, I just wanted to get your thoughts on that.
It might start with this. I think, again, you're absolutely right. I mean, I think even particularly with trade, even at a UK level, there are some really, really interesting issues around sort of new modes in which companies operate, cross-border, contract manufacturing. All these sorts of things means exactly identifying kind of where the economic activity originates is really quite challenging, and those are exacerbated when you get below a nation state level. One of my favorite examples is possibly apocryphal, was people were looking at trade from Wales to the rest of the UK and found that Wales was a major exporter of oil. And that was simply because Milford Haven was where a lot of the oil was landed for the UK. And if you simply count the amount of oil leaving Wales, it looks like a very large exporter. And, you know, what you really need to do is get beneath the surface to understand what you're really interested in, and simply counting things can give you some misleading approaches. But I do think it is kind of difficult, and I think some of those things are really exacerbated. Jane's point around, you know, kind of headquarters versus where people are employed. We often use where people are employed as a proxy, and for some activities that could be very reasonable. For other activities that could be entirely misleading. So I think it is very, 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 very challenging. So I don't have a particular answer to that one, but again, it's kind of the key thing here is being very clear about kind of what statistics are going to be used for. You know, is this going to be used to, you know, determine some policy that's going to have fundamental effects for the country, or is it something that people are interested in as a, you know, nice to have? So again, I think it's a really, really, really good point, and as I don't think it's just at a subnational level, but many of those issues are exacerbated at a subnational level.
If I could just come in on,
yeah, we'll come to Ed first, and then I'll come to you, Jane. Welcome back, Ed.
Oh, sorry, Jane. Do you want to go ahead? This is more your area. I was gonna waffle as I normally do. You'll probably say something much more meaningful than me. You go ahead, Jane.
Well, I'll try and say something, and then you can waffle. So no, I was just going to agree with Jonathan. I don't have any answers, but yes, Mary, they're a really good question about kind of the concepts, and just, you know, thinking, you know, when we try and put a kind of number on something, and it's quite a movable concept that people will interpret in different ways. So just thinking about some of the, we are trying to work on kind of new measures. So if you think about, trade very simply, kind of imports and exports, well, actually, is it a better measure to look at things like trade in value added, so the knock-on effects of trade? But again, there's sort of issues with the concepts, and sometimes you're right about the sort of data collection. That ONS have been doing some kind of trialing of questions, I think particularly around foreign direct investment, and even businesses themselves can't say, exactly where does the trade sit, is exactly where does the investment sit. Trying to, even if the business, your own business, trying to say exactly where it occurred, kind of at a regional level, is difficult for businesses even themselves. So how on earth can we then collect data and be very precise about it? But I think we just have to be clear about what we can and can't say for the data, and what we've actually measured, and keep working on things like new measures like TIVA, etc. Ed.
So I think Mary's question is really on point, and I think it explains why we have an ESCoE. If the solution to all of these problems was simply, let's get some more data, we just need to find the data sources. Once we've got the data sources, they'll automatically populate our models, and out will emerge the answer. You probably wouldn't need an ESCoE. You just need some good people who are good at sourcing data and accessing it and tidying it up. But the truth is that these problems are conceptual in nature as much as they are in terms of just sheer data themselves. And you need an ESCoE because you need to bring people who've got a conceptual framework that can work through these issues. So I think, Mary, your question is a really, really good advert for having a specialist body drawing in academic research to not simply focus on data, but focus on the conceptual frameworks that give the data meaning.
Great, thanks. It's a question here from Paul Misen, which I'll just read out around what country or countries other than the UK has been particularly successful or more successful at navigating the path through creating more detailed subnational statistics, and what can we learn from them? So are there any other good examples that we can learn from who are good, maybe even in the example of internal trade statistics, for example?
I'm struggling. Sorry, I'm struggling a little bit with my computer. I think it's very difficult. I think it's obviously it's also a bit difficult to generalize, because some countries have a sort of decentralized statistical system where almost by default you have state level ways of sort of summing different statistics. I think it's difficult to sort of, again, every country starts from its own sort of unique institutional arrangement. So I think it's quite difficult to generalize. But again, the areas that I think are most interesting and most exciting, and where people have added the most, have been countries that have been quickest to adopt administrative data. I think that's been the area where I think you can learn the most, and certainly some of the Nordics would be good examples of that, and where there is a high degree of localized data available. So I think it's difficult to sort of learn from a sort of country in terms of, they've gone about it in a particular, that they've done this. I think you have to look at kind of what's driven it, and often what has driven it has been administrative data. So that's kind of where you get I think some of the most most richness. And yeah, it's the Nordics, it's countries like the Netherlands, places like that have really embraced that administrative data that probably have led the way, I think.
Yeah, I would agree with that, and I think the key point is kind of try to work with other countries and learn from them. So, being part of, and attending things like OECD and WTO, and learning and being part of the international community that are all grappling with these challenges and working together across boundaries.
Great. Yeah, Ed.
Well, very briefly, I'm not going to, give my kind of league table of the countries that I think are great or less great. But what I would say is to answer that question, I'd want to look at countries that have grappled with this question of moving from heavily centralized, not just models of data, but models of governance, to things which are more supporting distinct local decision making and local governance. I think that would be the place to look to get the best learning for the UK. And if my earlier answer, the reason you have an ESCoE is for the conceptual problems, I think the reason you have a Centre for Cities is to build up the data knowledge and data capability at the below national level.
Yep. So just picking up on something Jane said there about international cooperation, there's a question there from Margaret on that specifically. Margaret McAvoy, can you ask your question, please?
Yeah, okay, thank you. It kind of follows on actually from the comments that have already been made. Now that the UK is outside the EU, is there any cooperation going on between the UK stats producers and regulators with the similar EU statistical authorities on the statistical matters? Because I know when I was in government, I attended many Eurostat meetings. We're talking about particularly about tourism statistics, where they had some very useful things to offer.
So it might be easier. So the withdrawal agreement includes a clause around statistical cooperation, and the challenge with that is, while we left the transition period a while ago, the withdrawal agreement wasn't ratified on both sides until relatively recently. So there is certainly the opportunity for cooperation under the withdrawal agreement. Exactly how that plays out, we're still, as I said, given it, I think on the EU side, the withdrawal agreement wasn't ratified until May. We are still early in that discussion. I think the more general point here, and one that Jane made, is on lots of these issues we need international cooperation. We need to get the frameworks right. One of the things that has dogged certainly UK trade statistics in the recent past has been a very quaint issue of non-monetary gold, and so we've been working internationally to think about how we deal with that. How do we deal with cryptocurrencies in international trade statistics, and lots of other things? So that international element of getting the frameworks right, and that cooperation more generally on the sort of day-to-day issues remains really very, very important. And at the moment that's very good. This week has been some OECD and meetings around statistics, and cooperation remains very, very strong. We've all been through the pandemic as well, and all had to grapple with lots of new issues and new data sources. So that international community around statistics remains very, very strong.
Great, thanks. Marianne, you've got a question about PAYE employee data. Can I maybe ask you to pose your question to the panel, please?
Yes, thank you. Very interesting insights. And pre-2010, there were ONS agents in regional development agencies. So as the Bank of England is moving in that direction, maybe they need to think about getting ONS people back out, maybe even in the Productivity Institute forums across the country. There could be some kind of cross-correlation there between places. But in terms of the PAYE data, when I've looked at it at the kind of NUTS1 regional level, there's this really big hit to jobs in London. But if you look at the productivity jobs data, you don't get that same hit. And I'm assuming it's based on the fact that PAYE is residence-based and the productivity jobs come from a kind of workplace-based analysis. And so is this kind of saying that a lot of the people kind of working in London are essentially still able to work, but it's really more the services in London that have been hit? And that's what's kind of come off the PAYE payroll?
So certainly, I mean, this is a really interesting issue, and it's one that sort of gets into, is back to this sort of with anything, understanding your concepts and kind of where the measurement issues come from. And I think some of these issues have just been magnified by the pandemic about kind of where does that economic activity lie, and if people are working from home yet and their nominal office is in London, how do we account for that particular output? And I think that in many ways that's been there for a while, but it's been brought into sharp relief, I think, by the pandemic, and again, it is an issue that sort of cuts across lots and lots of different areas. As I said, internationally, you start to see this with kind of understanding back to things like contract manufacturing, kind of where does the sort of intellectual property for some of these things lie. So I think there's a whole set of these things that you need to start thinking about, and it also then it comes down to kind of back to where you sort of think the sort of functional economic area is as well. So I think there's sort of lots of different angles to this you need to think through about kind of what are you interested in, what are you trying to measure, getting your geographies right to capture that sort of functional economic area as well. So and it does tell you quite a lot as well about kind of potential patterns of activity across different sectors. If you see these differences between residents and place of work for particular sectors as well. So I think there's quite a rich story to tell there.
Great. Okay. Thanks for your question, Marianne. Sanjeev, you've got a question on measuring trade and some of the changes we've seen over recent years. You're on mute, Sanjeev, if you're trying to talk. Excellent.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Graeme, thanks. I think there's quite a breadth and depth of enriched comments from the panelists, which are really useful and really good. I mean, I could have lots of issues, but I've got two aspects. The first one is the concept of trade has changed, but our collections have not. So, for example, trading value-added, global value chains, business functions, how they operate with cross-border and cross-regional trade. So do you think at some point we need to consider a different approach for collecting the national and regional data? And then without the borders, I mean, obviously Northern Ireland is slightly different because it's surrounded by the water, but without the borders, do we need a very different approach now for regional trade? Because it's clear with devolution and the focus on regional, that trade we do need to collect in a much better quality basis, representative basis, but the existing tools don't allow an easy job. I think Jane hit the nail on the head with some of the challenges. And then the additional thing I would want to add, I didn't put down in the text, was I raised the fact that there's cyclical interest in regional, and I'll probably pose this towards Ed more so. How do you think, or should we think of developing now something more sustained on the regional dimension? For example, we used to have statistical presences in the English regions, which have gone, and they would provide huge amount of statistical intelligence and metadata of what's going on, whether it's at ward level, region, county level, etc. So that's an additional question. I think, do we need to start thinking differently of the regions? England is a residual because we can develop Wales, Scotland's in place, Northern Ireland, but what do we need to do for England? We need a different approach. Thanks.
So I think on your first point, I think that's absolutely right. Without borders to cross, counting things becomes much harder. I think some of this has got to be in the we can't necessarily create surveys that will allow us to get to that, because that'll just be too burdensome. I think there's a really under the area that's really interesting is kind of how do we get into business to business transaction data so we can understand some of those things better. I think that's got to be the way forward there. Some of those new data sources I think will allow us to do that. Otherwise we're going to be relying quite a lot on apportioning activity in one form or another. And again, that might be reasonable for some parts of the economy, and might be unreasonable for others. I think that kind of how do we cover and make certain we've got the whole of that sort of local insight, I think is a really interesting issue. I'm also a little bit, I do worry if sort of having one person based in in Newcastle allows us to understand everything that's going on in the northeast, or somebody sitting in Edinburgh or Glasgow being able to understand everything that's going on in Scotland. It's a much more nuanced picture, but at the same time, I also, we need that level of engagement. So I'm not certain quite how you achieve it. But I do think you need that, and so it is kind of interesting and quite varied across the country. Having done lots of sort of regional outreach, you go to some places and there's a really vibrant community of people really interested in the statistics, really engaged. In other areas, that's less so. So I think there's a real sort of challenge. This is an emerging area. I think, and in some parts of, for example, Manchester has been very engaged in this for a long time. If you go to other places, less so. So it is kind of a bit of a challenge, and I think it's something we need to be very, very mindful of, because if I look back to one of my earlier comments, I think we can't just produce the numbers. We need to be able to sort of understand and tell the stories, and that requires bringing together some local knowledge with the statistics.
Great. Jane, Ed, any comments on Sandy's question?
The second part of Sandy's question was sort of tagged for me, and in the interest of time, I'll be very succinct. My answer, Sandy, to your question is yes. I think that will be very much worth exploring. And to Jonathan's point about whether one person in Newcastle can be expected to understand everything about Newcastle, very fair point. If that's the task you set that one person, then I think you'll end up being disappointed. You're absolutely right, Jonathan. But I think if you think the task of that one person in Newcastle is to get closer to what the governance institutions in Newcastle want to understand, what they care about, how they want to use data, I think that's more doable. So it depends what you set the task. If the task is the latter, I think you could do that, and I think that would be transformational.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And just coming in on the first point of Sanji's question, yeah, I'd agree with Jonathan around, as I've said in my opening kind of remarks, that there's so much you can do with the current way that we collect trade statistics, and there's more we can do, but there's also a limit to how far you can push that data. So thinking about potentially new surveys, but there are limitations with that, new and novel data sources, but also how you bring different data sources together to get that kind of wider picture of trade.
Great. Excellent. Well, I'm conscious of time, and it's good Zoom etiquette to finish just before the hour to give people a chance to go and grab a cup of tea and stretch their legs before they go to their next meeting. Can I just thank Ed, Jane, and Jonathan for your fascinating insights and also your openness to answer the questions from colleagues. Can also thank everybody on the call who joined us over the course of this today for this fascinating webinar. It's hugely appreciated that you've joined us, and from being part of earlier sessions, the questions engagement have been really great, and it is encouraging to see such interest in regional statistics in the UK. Can also just finally thank Mercy, Sarah, Rebecca, and the wider team at ESCoE for their organising of today and the effort. I know what it's like to put in events such as these. It's a huge amount of effort goes on in the background, and it's greatly appreciated, and thank you very much for all your work for today. It leaves it to me then just to close this conference and to thank everyone once again for joining us, and hope to see you all soon, and bye for now.